The world of Peppa Pig might seem like just a fun and cheerful children's cartoon, but behind all the laughter and joy, there are stories filled with suspense, mystery, and even tragedy. Ooh. So do you think you know the true origin of Madame Gazelle? Ooh, ha 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 ha! Many people get confused and think Peppa's teacher is a vampire, but in reality, they're all mistaken. Peppa Pig was created by British writers and animators Neville Astley and Mark Baker. Both grew up in British culture, and because of that, they have knowledge of certain stories that happened in the country. One example is the origin of the little girl Peppa, who lived in East Anglia and was sadly eaten by the pigs from the farm she lived on, as we mentioned in another video here on our channel, which you can check out after watching this one. But in the case of Madame Gazelle, our sources indicate that there's also a story about the origin of this character. Unfortunately, many fans and even the creators of the show spread the vampire myth, but the real story is much darker. But if you want to know all about it, stick with us, because we're going to tell you the true story of Madame Gazelle. Grab your popcorn, because another Cinewave is starting. The show uses animal characters to grab the attention of children, but every real-world story involves humans, and in this case, we're talking about a woman named Grazelle Morgenstein, born in a small town in Romania, not in England. This is the first fact that connects Madame Gazelle to the theory that she is a vampire, because the legend of these night creatures that feed on blood has been linked to this country for centuries. Grazelle was a young woman living in Romania around the 1930s, over 80 years ago, and unfortunately, at that time, people didn't know much about the disease we now call porphyria, even though this condition had already been discovered by scientists sometime earlier. The small town where Grazelle was born didn't have access to this kind of information, and because of that, since she was a child, little Gazellina, as she was known, suffered a lot of prejudice. The disease had a symptom that made its victims unable to be exposed to sunlight, which led to the rumor that the young girl might very well be a vampire. But in reality, this was the least of the problems Grazelle would face in her life. A long time ago, in Europe, people believed in various fairy tales that entertained them, and parents used these stories to teach important lessons to their children. But when the story was about monsters, fear and prejudice caused villagers to be cruel to the innocent and strange. In Grazelle Morgenstein's story, the people in the village where she lived always thought she was very strange, almost never going out in the sun, and when she did, her skin had terrible allergic reactions. This led many people to think that she had been cursed with vampirism, and they believed the poor girl had been turned into a bloodsucker. The allergic reactions caused by sunlight left Grazelle with many wounds all over her body, and this aged her skin. Many years before she was even considered an adult, the girl already looked 40 years old when she was actually only 15. When she was a little girl, Grazelle's family consisted of just 4 people, a father and 3 daughters. Everyone in that house had the same condition, porphyria, which everyone called the vampire disease. An important detail about Mr. Morgenstein is that he taught his daughters at home because, due to their condition, they didn't attend school. Keep this detail in mind because it's crucial and relates to Madame Gazelle's upbringing in Peppa Pig. If you know the Dracula legend, you'll know that the king of vampires had 3 young-looking wives, exactly the same number of daughters that Mr. Morgenstein had. 3. The people in Grazelle's town started to think the Morgenstein family resembled the Dracula legend, even though it was just a coincidence, and Grazelle's sisters, named Griselda and Gabriella, were actually just daughters of the men who lived with them. Unfortunately, lack of knowledge leads to these kinds of interpretations. When the sisters had at least one cloudy day to go outside and play in the street, all 3 seemed to have superpowers, because everyone in the town thought they were much older than they really were. Remember we explained that some light allergies made their skin age? People in the town would watch the teenagers running and jumping, but looking much older than their age. They thought, how come these 3 ladies have so much energy? Putting all this false evidence together, it wasn't long before the day of tragedy came for the family. Before we talk more about this intriguing story that led to the creation of Peppa's teacher, if you also believe that bad things happen to good people, leave a comment below with #BadLuck. It was a sunny day and the villagers chose the right moment to destroy what they believed was a threat to them, their children, and their animals. Dozens of them armed themselves with torches and knocked on the Morgenstein family's door, demanding that they leave. The argument between the father and the angry villagers was intense, until, unfortunately, a fierce attack occurred when a man shoved the father, causing him to fall and hit his head. This attack killed the father of the 3 sisters. Terrified, the 3 Morgenstein sisters knew they would meet the same fate as their father, who couldn't do anything against the out-of-control mob, so they fled through the back of their simple house toward the forest. After some time spent sleeping in the cold forest, the girls managed to get a ride with a kind salesman traveling by cart to the area, and they ended up in Bucharest, where their story would continue. The truth is, Grazelle Morgenstein wasn't just a sick girl with a tragic story. Since childhood, the poor girl had one dream: to make friends. She had her sisters, but she also dreamed of being friends with other children, something she never managed to do in her village because of the disease, but in Bucharest, people were more welcoming. Also, medical treatment for porphyria was more accessible, which helped the 3 of them to be able to go out into the sunlight. They still faced prejudice because the skin wounds caused by years of suffering had caused an eternal aging, and they would never look young again. At the time, in the early 1940s, Graziella and her sisters still needed to study, but since they no longer had their father, the three also had to work. As Graziella always loved being around other children, she managed to get a job as a teacher's assistant at a primary school, which helped ease all the suffering she'd endured until then. The big city also offered plenty of opportunities for fun, and it didn't take long for the three of them to go out and explore some places. Since Graziella was already working, Griselda and Gabrielle also wanted jobs. One night, Griselda saw a street band and said to her sisters, "Why don't we start a band? We do something fun, and we could make some money." At this point, you might think they formed a really cool band and lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. In those years, Europe wasn't doing well, and World War II was spreading across the continent. Unfortunately, many people lost their jobs and their lives due to the terrible war, and once again the three sisters Graziella, Griselda, and Gabrielle were affected. Fortunately, the three sisters survived, and with the end of the conflict, they decided to leave Romania and travel to a country that offered more opportunities. Now as young women, the three of them learned to play instruments. Graziella became interested in the guitar, which led the sisters to call her Graziella da Guitar, or just Gigi, while Griselda went on to learn the drums, and the third sister, Gabrielle, specialized in the bass. You should remember that this nickname, Gigi, was brought into the Peppa Pig show, proving that this is a way to honor the real woman's story. They called themselves the Graziellas do Rock, which sounds quite a lot like Gazellas do Rock, don't you think? The Morgenstein sisters became a very famous band in South London in the 1950s. Their biggest hit was the song, Hit Yeah Yeah, which we can hear at the end of an episode of Peppa Pig. The three sisters were very happy, but Graziella felt a tightness in her chest. There was something missing in her life. And to make sure you never miss our videos, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to receive updates. Being part of a band was really cool, but Graziella was still unhappy, and she knew exactly why. When she got her first job as a teaching assistant, she felt a sense of comfort in her heart. She enjoyed teaching children. When Graziella was in the classroom, it felt like her father, who was also her teacher, was somehow by her side. Having children to learn from her made Graziella very happy, but to follow this dream, she would have to give up the Graziellas do Rock. London was a bright city full of art and culture, but Graziella missed the countryside, the small town life. Was it possible that she would find a village where people wouldn't treat her cruelly? Yes, and that place was the town of Norwich, which is in East Anglia, the same place where the tragic story of Peppa Pig happened. Today, Norwich isn't exactly a small countryside town, but in the 1950s, it was a different story. When Graziella arrived there, she had the idea of opening a school, but she didn't have much money for it. So in a bold act of courage, she used all her savings to teach poor children in the house she lived in. This was seen as a great act of kindness, and for many years, the woman with the face of an elderly person taught generations of children, including their children later, becoming known to everyone as Madame Graziella. The idea for Madame Gazelle in the show came from this fact because in the 1950s, Graziella was still a young woman in her early 20s, but already had the face of an elderly person. When she really reached an old age, people would think, wow, she was already old when I was a child. We see Mommy Pig questioning this in the episode where everyone throws a farewell party for Madame Gazelle. When creators Neville Astley and Mark Baker were researching the character designs for the children's show, they discovered the brilliant story of the immigrant woman who traveled from Romania to England to become a teacher. This fantastic woman's story and that of her sisters seemed perfect for inclusion in the show. And of course, the choice to turn the character into a gazelle was inspired by the name of the band she had with her sisters. One cool thing we found out is that Graziella liked to teach musical instruments to her students, and that for a long time, due to lack of money, she was the only teacher in that part of the city. This might also be the reason why the school roof is always broken, and why they always needed to hold some kind of fundraiser to raise money. Throughout the series, we see that Mommy Pig even goes skydiving to help fix the roof, but there is no information about anyone doing this in the real world. But one thing that is definitely true is that the creators' research indicates that Graziella did indeed have many problems with school supplies, one of the most expensive to get being glitter, which Madame hated her students using. Real-world references are always really cool, and it's even better to learn about the story that inspired the characters of Peppa Pig. We've talked a lot about this show here on the channel. We've picked 2 more videos for you to watch, and we'll see you in the next one.